Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to the second day of official Amonkhet previews. And we have a lot of cards to look at today. You can see from the screen here, we're going to be looking at the Blue God Kefnet in some detail. Of course, that's a Japanese language spoiler, but we have a translation. We'll be going over that as well as over 20 other cards. So let's just jump right in. We're going to begin with Cast Out. The first of the white cards we'll be seeing today. This costs a white and 3. It's an enchantment. It has flash. And when this enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until Cast Out leaves the battlefield. Also can be cycled for 1 white. Now, typically, I would say I'm not super excited about an Oblivion Ring that costs a white and 3. However, this one does give you additional versatility. It adds flash to it and also adds the ability to cycle for 1 white. That makes a big difference. I'm okay paying that extra mana of any color for this ability and for the spell, quite honestly. How many times have you been in a situation where you're already winning the game, you're just attacking in, you just want something that's going to be aggressive, whether that's a burn spell or another creature or something, and you draw an Oblivion Ring, right? Well, this does give you a chance to send that back and try for something else and really put the pressure on your opponent. There's going to be times that's going to be very useful. When you're in a more defensive situation and you're maybe playing a more hardcore control deck and you want to hold back a little bit, the flash ability is fantastic for that reason alone. So I really like this. This will see standard play, I think, very easily. Great card for you in limited as well. Next we have Sacred Cat. This costs 1 white. It's a 1/1 with lifelink, and it costs 1 to embalm. Of course, it's a creature type cat. Typically, I would say, well, not too exciting here. I mean, a 1/1 lifelinker for 1, is that great? Sometimes, probably most of the time, not even good enough to really see play in limited. However, we're going to see some cards in a few moments that really take advantage of 1-drops. And you'll kind of know what I'm talking about once we get there, and I'll point it out. But it could at least up the ante a little bit on some of these 1-drop cards in the set, at least in the limited environment. There's other implications for these cards, perhaps in standard. But again, I don't think this is going to be the 1-drop you're going to be playing in standard. It'll be more like the Inspector or something like that. But more on that in a little bit, and kind of just remember this card as we go forward. Next we have Crop Elite. This costs a white and 3. It's a bird warrior, 2/2 flyer, and you can exert it, and if you do, you'll be able to give your creatures +1/+1 till end of turn. It's a fine limited card. There's not a whole lot for me to say about this one. I don't like 2/2 flyers for 4, even if they do have special abilities like this one. The exert ability is interesting if I'm already ahead and I know I can go wide. So maybe I include this in my deck if I'm really honestly planning on having a strategy where I can go wide and I feel confident that I'm going to be able to do that relatively consistently. If not, this will probably set out a lot of games in the sideboard. Alright, as we move into blue, we have Kefnet, the Blue God. This, of course, is a Japanese language spoiler, so it is translated to the best of our ability at this point. I don't really think it's Kefnet the Careful. It's probably a very loose translation of the name, but I think the rest is right. A blue and 2, legendary creature god, flying indestructible. This can attack or block unless you have 7 or more cards in hand, but you can pay a blue and 3, draw a card, and you may return a land you control from the battlefield to its owner's hand. Alright, so yesterday we saw the Red God, and I mentioned that it's a horrible card in probably 95% of decks, but it's a good card, actually probably a great card in the 5% of decks that are looking for what that card does. And those are your red aggro decks, right? You're thinking about your burn decks, you're thinking about your combination of burn and small creatures, or maybe just your burn beatdown decks, usually mono red, sometimes red black. And the God was probably really awesome for those builds, and I guess we'll see that as time goes on. Now, this one is sort of doing the same thing. Like, it really is pigeonholed into one archetype, and that is hardcore, no playing around, Drago control. Like, that's about the only time I would consider playing this card, is in a deck like that. It wants to be the control finisher, but there's a weird tug of war going on here at the same time, which makes me feel like it could be a little inconsistent. The fact that a 5/5 indestructible flyer hitting the battlefield as your finisher would feel great under normal circumstances, but this one can't attack unless you have at least 7 cards in your hand. Now, it gives you a way to get there, but the compromise is at times you may have to take one of your lands back to your hand, and that is not what control wants to be doing. Now, many times when you're playing actual, like, hardcore Drago control, you are holding on to a lot of cards, of course. You have your counter spells, you have your removal spells, but there are also times you actually have to use those cards. You have to counter the threat your opponent's putting in play. You have to remove the threat that they got into play. You might end up in a counterspell war if you're playing in a mirror matchup or something like that. So you are going to be going through cards. And secondly, a lot of your cards you're going to be drawing are lands because those decks really, really need a strong mana base. And you're going to want to put those lands into play pretty quickly. So it's not like you're going to be sitting there with 7 cards in your hand all the time, right? Probably more realistically, you're holding on to 3 or 4 cards in a deck like that relatively consistently. So once this does hit the battlefield, when you do need it to get in its damage, you're going to have to jump through some hoops to make that happen, which means you're going to have to activate its ability, draw a card. I mean, that's good. But then you're going to bounce a land. And at that point, you're taking away from your ability to continue to grow that mana base, which is exactly what that particular style of deck really wants to do. It just feels really awkward to me. I will say this, in limited, it's probably playable just for its ability to draw some extra cards. Like, other than that, even if you never get to attack or block with it, drawing the cards and having basically a 3 casting cost creature that's sitting there doing nothing, but allowing you to draw cards as a mana sink might actually be good enough. So it's probably fine to play in limited regardless. I guess we'll wait and see a little bit on this card and see what other cards come out in the set, if there's other support cards to help make the drawback easier to deal with. If there are, I guess that could change things, but right now I'm a little shaky on this one. Alright, let's look at some other blue cards. We have Drake Haven. It costs a blue and 2. It's an enchantment. When you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. To me, this card feels like a better finisher in some ways than the previous one, because you're able to perhaps cycle a card at some point, discard a land or something, get yourself a 2/2. That might be good enough. Realistically, though, this card actually wants to be played in a cycling deck. Yes, it also activates when you discard, and there's probably ways to exploit that, especially with Madness. But I think for competitive purposes anyway, you're going to be thinking about how to create a full-on cycling deck to exploit this. And I think it could get there. Now, we haven't seen a whole lot of the set yet. We do have a lot more to go. But from what we've seen so far, feels like the pieces are coming into place that could exist. If you get this card in limited, it's not always going to be playable. It will be playable if you have enough cycling cards around it to support it, though, I think. Next, we have Scribe of the Mindful. This costs a blue and 2. It's a human cleric 2/2. You can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice it to return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Well, I'm not a big fan of this one. First off, I don't like paying 3 for a 2/2. Maybe I'm spoiled nowadays when it comes to that, but I just don't like doing it. And here's my biggest issue. I don't mind paying the 1 mana. I don't even mind sacrificing it. I think that's kind of to be expected with a ability like this. I don't like tapping it. That just makes this card way too slow. If you didn't have to tap it and other ways it was identical, I would be a lot more excited about this card. Like, I feel like it could find a place maybe even in Ad Nauseam or Storm decks or something like that. But quite honestly, the tapping effect just kind of kills this card for me. I really don't see it doing much. You might be able to have a number of good targets in a draft, and you could play one of these knowing you're going to recur something of value at some point later in the game. That would be acceptable. But even then, it's not always going to make your cut. Now let's look at a couple instances in the set that they showed us today that could play well with this, maybe in limited. And the first one's a reprint. It's Essence Scatter, 1 blue and 1. It's an instant counter target creature spell. I think this card is going to be phenomenal in this format, just from what we've seen so far. There's a lot of powerful creatures. We're going to see some more today, as a matter of fact. Also kind of makes sense why we have that cat snake we saw yesterday that can't be countered and makes all your creatures uncounterable. This is a very cheap creature counter spell, and this will see standard play. It has in the past. It definitely will again, and it's going to be good for you in limited too. The second one, Decision Paralysis. This one I'm not as excited about. It's a blue and 3 instant, another common. Tap up to 2 target creatures. These creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. It's fine in limited, especially if you have the means to kind of beat down, which a lot of decks will, and they'll be using blue as a support color. But there's cards that have been made in the past that do the same thing better, so I'm not super excited for this card seeing print, but it's good enough in limited for sure. All right, let's move on to black. We're going to begin with a Russian language card, Open Heart, loosely translated. A black and 1 sorcery. Target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-legendary, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. So this tells us a couple things. It tells us that legendary seems to be at least maybe a sub-theme here. And we know the gods, of course, are going to be legendary. We saw 2 of them already. But we're also going to see some other stuff. There's actually a cycle of legendary artifacts coming up a little bit later in the video we'll look at. So it feels like Legendary is a thing, at least kind of, sort of, in this set, so that's interesting. Secondly, though, the card itself actually feels pretty good. I mean, okay, I can't take a Legendary card, and I can't take a land from my opponent, but that leaves a lot of stuff open for 2 mana. Quite honestly, that seems decent, not to mention the information you're going to be getting. There's a lot of powerful creatures, a lot of powerful spells in this particular set. Yeah, this feels pretty good. I think this will see standard play. Great control card, definitely. And as far as limited goes, depending on what your archetype is in limited, this is very playable. Maybe not in an aggro build, but a lot of builds will be happy to run a copy of this. And it's an uncommon. You'll be able to find it relatively easily. Next, we have Splendid Agony. It costs a black and 2. It's an instant. Distribute 2 -1/-1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. At face value, you could use this at instant speed to take out one of your opponent's creatures, maybe 2 creatures, or you could use this as a combat trick to finish off an indestructible creature. But also, you can use this on your own creatures. And you may ask yourself, well, why would I want to do that? Well, we're going to look at a few cards in green in just a few moments that actually might want you to at least think about doing that. All right, let's move on to the red card, starting with Consuming Fervor. And I saw this spoiled earlier, and I thought to myself immediately, wow, this is like a red version of Unstable Mutation. Now, the wording's slightly different than Unstable Mutation, but for all practical purposes, it's basically a red version of it. And that was interesting. And the second thing I thought when I saw this was, could this be good? Because Unstable Mutation was actually really good back in the day. Now, there's some differences. When that card came out, there weren't a whole lot of Magic sets to play or to choose to play. There weren't as many answers as we have today. There weren't as many Magic sets in existence that we have in the standard format currently. So the game was very, very different. Having said that, though, we've seen a lot of hyper-aggressive cards. I mean, just yesterday we saw that 1/2 Menace card that was a 1 red drop, right? What if you played that turn 1? Played this on it on turn 2, maybe even another 1 drop at the same time on turn 2, you could be getting in there for some serious damage. Now, the problem is that if you do lose that creature, and we do live in a world of fatal pushes, then you just got 2 for 1, and it's not going to feel really good for you, right? Unless you're able to kind of get rid of the rest of your hand and follow up with the Red God or something like that. So is that strong enough? I guess we'll have to kind of see what other cards come out and maybe test that one. I would want to test it, though. I feel like it has potential. It's high risk, high reward, but I feel like it has some potential. And same kind of goes for limited. It's definitely not the same level of risk as you play in a constructed format, obviously, but you can still get 2 for 1, and you might not have as many good things to help you rebound in the limited environment. So it kind of is what it is, but again, I'd like to try it out and see how it plays. It is only 1 mana, at least it has that going for it. Alright, let's look at green. I mentioned this earlier, but here's a couple cards that play around with the -1/-1 theme. First, we have Exemplar of Strength. It's a green and 1, Human Warrior 4/4. When this enters the battlefield, you put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control, and whenever this attacks, you can remove a -1/-1 counter from it. If you do, you gain a life. Now, there's a couple ways you can look at this card. First off, if you have a great 1-drop, and then you play this on turn 2, you just throw all those -1/-1 counters on that 1-drop, it goes away, and you're stuck with this 4/4 beater on turn 2 that's attacking in on turn 3. That seems like it could be pretty good. The only problem with that idea is it's very high variance. You have to get that to work out perfectly, right? And you also want a good 1-drop, because if you get the 1-drop and you don't get this, you still want to be able to be competitive. So I'm thinking of like the Inspector. At least that gives you a clue token, if nothing else. And then when it dies, whether it dies to this or something else, at least you have the ability to restock your hand a little bit. Like, that could potentially be a thing. Now, if you don't have the 1-drop, this card gets a lot worse, obviously, because now it becomes basically a 1/1 when it comes into play as a 2 casting cost creature. Now, the second one I like a little better, Channeler Initiate. It costs a green and 1, Human Druid 3/4. When this enters the battlefield, put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control. But you can tap this to remove a -1/-1 counter from it and add a mana of any color to your mana pool. So it becomes a mana dork if it gets stuck with the -1/-1 counters. So same rules apply here. I mean, I could put those counters on the Inspector, for example, and have myself a 3/4 on turn 2. That seems pretty good if I want to go hyper aggressive. But if I just want to ramp, maybe I just choose to put the -1/-1 counters on this and I'm able to ramp. And that kind of versatility I really like. So I think the Initiate could see some standard play. Like, I feel like this is a very, very good card. If you're looking for a good good 2-drop mana dork, because it's hard to say that considering I feel like we've seen so many great 1-drop mana dorks over the years. This is the first 2-drop mana dork that I really, really like, and it's again because of its versatility more than anything. Alright, let's look at a few split cards. We have Prepared to Fight. This came to us from an Italian language spoiler. It costs a white and 1. It's an instant. Untap target creature, gains +2/+2, and has lifelink until end of turn. And then the green side is Fight. A green and 3. Sorcery. Target creature you control fights target creature an opponent controls, and it has Aftermath. If you're not familiar with Aftermath, basically it means you can only play it from your graveyard at sorcery speed. Now, here's my question about this card. It's decent for limited. Like, it's a fine card because it's green removal out of the graveyard. It's a nice combat trick that could gain you a little bit of life when you play the instant piece of it. I do like that. It's a fine card. But I feel like this really should have been uncommon. This is strange to me that it's rare. It just feels like one of those uncommon combat tricks that you see all the time. And yeah, it has the fight ability out of the graveyard, but you are jumping through some hoops to get it in the graveyard. And yeah, then it's just a fair removal spell. It's nothing crazy like a Fatal Push or anything like that. So it just feels really strange to me that this is at rare. I don't really see this seeing a lot of play in Standard or anything like that, but it's going to be decent and limited for you for sure. One last thing, too, that I do want to point out is that first ability does untap a creature, so that does play pretty good with Exert. That could come into play quite a bit, especially in limited for you. Seems like there's a lot of good Exert cards out there. Now, this one isn't uncommon, and it feels uncommon. Onward to Victory. A red into instant target creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is its power. Victory is a sorcery with Aftermath. Target creature gains double strike until end of turn. What I do like about this combat trick, especially the onward side, is maybe your opponent doesn't play around this. They tap out. You have like a 3/3 creature on board. You attack for 6 damage. Maybe you have yourself a fling. You get 12 damage off in one turn, just kind of out of nowhere. That is appealing. Now, it's not always going to happen, but it's very appealing. So I do see this being a very decent limited card, if nothing else. It is situational. It is high variance, probably a little too high variance to see play in, say, Standard, but I'd be happy to run this in limited. Next, we have a multicolor card, which is actually a embalm card. It's Temet, Vizier of Nectamon. Wow, I said it. And it costs a blue and white legendary creature, Human Cleric. That was my first try, believe it or not. At the beginning of combat, on your turn, target creature token you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. Has an embalm cost of a blue, white, and 3. And on your right side, you see the embalm token version of the card. It's interesting, I'll say that. Now, typically, I'm very high on 2-drops that have a lot of upside to them. The only thing is, this one's a little deceiving, because yes, it is a 2-drop, it's a 2/2, it has upside, but the fact of the matter is that upside interacts with another creature token. So, for you to really establish this as a thing on the battlefield, it's probably more like turn 3 or turn 4 when you're able to put this out and have a good token that's worth really using the ability on as well. This card does get interesting for commander purposes, though. If you're using a commander token deck, for example, maybe you're doing something along the lines of playing Bant colors and you have like Advent of the Worm token, stuff like that. Like, I could see this being actually kind of fun to mess around with in Commander. Maybe not super, super powerful, but it could lead to some fun synergies, if nothing else. It's fine in limited too, especially if you have some other embalm cards to play along with this card. Could be good getting those last few points of damage across. So, decent card. I don't know if I could see it doing a whole lot in Standard, at least with the cards we've seen so far. I mean, if they add a lot of good support to this particular mechanic, this card could become Standard playable, but at least as of right now, I think it's a decent limited card and could be really interesting in Commander. Alright, next we have that cycle I mentioned earlier, and these are legendary artifacts. They all cost 3, and you get one that coincides with each color in each of the gods. So you have Akira's Monument, Kefna's Monument, Bantu's Monument, Hezeret's Monument, and Rona's Monument. Now, the corresponding color, whenever you cast a creature spell, is going to cost 1 less to cast, and then whenever you cast one of those creature spells, you get a certain effect. The white one, the effect is you get a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. The blue one, you get to target a creature an opponent controls, and that doesn't untap during its next untap step. The black one, you get to drain a life. The red one, you get to rummage, which means you have to discard a card first, but if you do, you can draw a card. And then finally, the green one gives one of your creatures +2/+2 and trample till end of turn. Looking at these, the biggest drawback is the fact they cost 3, they hit the battlefield, and they don't do anything on that turn. So that's going to be a little slow in some situations, right? Secondly, they're also legendary, so you can't stack them with each other. You can play different ones, and if you're in a multicolor deck playing multiple ones of these, that could be interesting. But at least if you're thinking about 1 or 2 colors, you can't stack the same ones due to their legendary condition. So in that way, it's a drawback. It's kind of cool to have 3-drop legendary artifacts at uncommon, though, and it does go to show that they are definitely trying to create some sort of legendary sub-theme here in the set, and I kind of like that idea. As far as the power of these go, I don't necessarily see any of these making it into standard just because it's too conditional upon other things going on. In other words, do you have other creatures to cast, and are you able to make use of the effect you get at that given time? Just too high variance. For limited, some are better than others. I kind of like the white one. I like being able to generate some extra power and toughness on the battlefield and also the vigilance. I think that's interesting. I also like the green one quite a bit. +2/+2 and trample could definitely matter in a game of limited, especially if you have a stalled board state. I'm not super high on the blue one because it doesn't even tap the creature. So if the creature's tapped, it won't untap next time, but that just feels way too slow to me. The black one, you drain life, but again, I don't see myself running this over a lot of other things probably because it doesn't really become good until you're able to trigger it maybe the 4th or 5th time. Hazoret's Monument is okay. I don't mind Rummaging. That's actually pretty decent. Rummaging, I think, is okay and limited a lot of the times, especially, again, later in the game when you're trying to pitch lands and stuff like that. That could actually be pretty decent for you. So some of them better than others. They all definitely have certain roles that they'll fulfill in limited. Having said that, those are the cards for today. Before you go, if you check out the description below, you'll find a couple ways to help support us. One of which is Patreon, and you'll find that we're actually really close to our next Patreon goal. Check the information out there. Secondly, you'll find links to our Amazon affiliate store. If you make any purchases through any of those links, a small percentage will come back to help the channel. And you can find Amonkhet products on there. If you're looking for booster boxes or bundles or what have you, they are starting to populate on there. So until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.